This is author Deanna L. Lawless, and I want to talk with you about the narcissistic family system and the evangelical authoritarian system. Research and clinical data confirm a highly potent symbiotic overlap between narcissistic family systems and evangelical authoritarian systems. When a narcissistic family operates within a high-control, authoritarian religious environment, the family's internal toxicity is supercharged by the structure of the church. In psychology and sociology, this intersection is heavily studied through the lenses of right-wing authoritarianism, RWA, religious trauma syndrome, RTS, and family scapegoating abuse, FSA. The church environment provides the narcissistic parent with an airtight, divinely sanctioned framework to justify abuse, enforce absolute control, and completely isolate the scapegoat. Rather than looking at these as separate issues, clinical researchers study how authoritarian theology acts as a greenhouse for pathological narcissism. Let's discuss the concept of spiritual narcissism. Clinical research indicates that highly dogmatic, fundamentalist spaces attract individuals with narcissistic traits because these spaces offer external validation of moral superiority. A landmark study found that while devout, humble faith improves ethical judgment, as narcissistic traits rise in religious individuals, their ethical judgment plummets dramatically. They use religious rules to justify cruel behavior. Let's talk about collective narcissism. Sociological research published on ResearchGate and academia.edu outlines how authoritarian evangelical cultures can foster collective narcissism, an inflated, hyper-defensive belief in the group's absolute rightness and moral superiority over outsiders. A narcissistic parent seamlessly maps their personal entitlement onto this group identity. Now let's talk about religious trauma syndrome. Coined by Dr. Marlene Weinell, RTS is the clinical framework used to describe the complex trauma, CPTSD, experienced by individuals breaking away from authoritarian, high-control religions. Weinell's research highlights that the trauma stems from two layers: the toxic, shame-heavy conditioning inside the system and the total social ruin, estrangement that occurs upon leaving. When a narcissistic family system is embedded in an authoritarian evangelical church, the standard roles, narcissist, enabler, scapegoat, golden child, are given absolute spiritual authority. In standard narcissistic families, the parent demands obedience based on ego. In an authoritarian evangelical system, the parent demands obedience by claiming they are God's direct representative on earth. Scripture, such as honor thy father and mother, or verses on parental rod discipline, is cherry-picked and weaponized. Psychological literature on authoritarian parenting styles notes a direct link between rigid, punitive parental control and the development of severe anxiety, low self-worth, and deep attachment wounds in children, because the child is taught that their own mind and heart are fundamentally deceptive. In a secular family, the scapegoat is labeled difficult or crazy. In an authoritarian evangelical family, the scapegoat's healthy boundaries, questions, or independent identity are pathologized as sin, spiritual rebellion, or demonic influence. The scapegoat is rebranded as demonic or rebellious. This completely destroys the scapegoat's internal sense of safety, They are forced to believe that resisting their parents' abuse is equivalent to resisting God. This creates the exact conditions required for deep, localized betrayal trauma and CPTSD. The codependent enabler spouse inside this system is heavily protected and encouraged by the church culture. Authoritarian evangelical structures heavily emphasize rigid gender roles, submissiveness, and keeping the peace at all costs. The enabler spouse's choice to look the other way, absorb abuse, or hand the children over to a narcissistic parent's rage is framed as holy submission, spiritual endurance, or covering the family in prayer. The church systematically shames the enabler out of ever protecting the children or leaving the marriage. The golden child in this environment is the one who perfectly performs the religious scripts. They become the youth group leader, the model child, or the public display of the family's godly legacy. They are heavily rewarded with praise and status, making them fiercely defensive of both the family system and the church structure that elevates them. Research on high control groups by trauma therapists highlights that isolation is the primary mechanism of control. Narcissistic families use the church's natural insularity, be in the world, not of the world, to sever the scapegoat's access to secular mental health professionals, alternative viewpoints, or safe adults outside the bubble. If the adult scapegoat eventually goes no contact, the narcissistic family can trigger a church-wide smear campaign utilizing shunning or framing the scapegoat as a spiritual tragedy who has lost their salvation. This allows the narcissistic parent to remain entirely blameless in the eyes of their community.